Feng in the palace. In the 12 towers, made up and ready since morning, they watch for their prince from the immortal's lookout. The door latch, a carved animal's head, hangs cold and silent. From a dragon-shaped water clock, their day runs out slowly. Cloud curls combed, again they check the mirror. Silk gowns ready, a little more perfume. They look across to the main hall and watch through open blinds as uniformed palace maids prepare the emperor's bed. So, we have here a poem, and first of all, we haven't, this is the first and also the only poem by author Feng included in this anthology, so we will start with a short biography. So Feng is not a very important Tang writer. In fact, this is the first time I've encountered him. He is a writer of the late Tang period, and he passed the examinations, the Jinshi, in 841, and was appointed to some minor posts, like editor of the palace library and so on. Later, through the influence of a patron, he was sent to the west of the country, to Sichuan, and he served there for a few years. And in 867, he was recalled to the capital, Chang'an, to serve as vice minister of the Court of Imperial Sacrifices, which was his highest courtly post. And a few years after that, about less than a decade, he died around 876. His poetry was pretty well regarded during his lifetime, and 90 of his poems survive. But as I said, in this anthology, he only has this one. So from the poem, you would say that Shui Fang is pretty well representative of the late trend in Tang poetry, which we've already seen exemplified, especially in up to now in the poems of Li Shangjing. And the idea was that this was generally decadentist poetry, which dwelled on escapism and luxurious and decadent topics, like, you know, beautiful women in luxurious surroundings in the court, beautiful objects, that sort of thing. That is, at a time when the empire was collapsing, at a time when massive peasant rebellions were taking place in different parts of the country, and in which the court bureaucracy and the emperors were proving incompetent and unable to sustain the dynasty. Writers move away from the typical Confucian topics, or at least the poetry that is considered more representative of these periods of time is generally the sort of evasive, pleasure-seeking poetry which Confucian scholars always frown upon. This is a very good example of this. This is, I think, even from the title in the original, this is described as a palace poem, not only because it has a setting in the palace, but because it corresponds to the stereotype and to the topics of palace-style poetry. We've talked about this a lot in previous poems. There was a style of poetry called concubines, which is a courtly poem, court poem, palace poetry, which developed during the period of disunion during the Six Dynasties. And it's very well exemplified by the poetry of Qian Wendi, one of the emperors of the Liang dynasty. And it's also very exemplified in an anthology called New Songs from the Jade Terrace. And it's poetry that's basically focused on love and on sensuality and on beautiful women, imperial concubines in luxurious palatial settings. And you could describe it as a little bit frivolous. And another less critical way of describing it from our modern aesthetic perspective is a non-moralistic, aesthetically inclined poetry, which focuses on the technical, on the aesthetic aspects of creating beauty, but also on Epicurean topics of pleasure and love and beauty and beautiful objects represented through the poem. Now, this poem exemplifies this sort of topic very well. The poem describes a scene taking place in the imperial palace. So, probably, we guess it could be the imperial palace. I think, strictly speaking from the text, it could perhaps refer to any of the royal courts. The Chinese emperors generally created for their lesser secondary sons and relatives, they carved up small kingdoms in the provinces, and so this could be a poem about one of those kings, but probably more likely about the emperor himself. What is the scene? Well, we are in the harem of the emperor, in the secluded quarters where his wives and concubines live. We have 12 towers, so we might imagine that there's a woman in each of the towers. Each of those towers is an apartment for one of the beauties. And they are preparing themselves, bedecking themselves, beautifying themselves in the hope of receiving an imperial visit. And that's what the poem basically describes. We have these women in luxurious surroundings, which are described in the poem, uh, making themselves more beautiful for the emperor in the hope that he will come. And in the end of the poem, in the last couplet, it is implied that the emperor is coming. He will have to select one of the 12 bells. So the poem is, as I said, you could say the topic is, I wouldn't say love, but maybe desire, lust, impatience. The poem is focused from the point of view of the concubines. In fact, in one of the poems that I've read, in another version, another translation of this poem, the second part of the poem, the last 4 lines, is focused through one of them. It's what one of them is seeing and doing instead of what the others are seeing and doing. And this is possible. This is a possible interpretation of the poem. It's not the one chosen here by Geoffrey Waters, who in the second half of the poem refers to all of them. He doesn't make any distinction. And remember, this is easy. This is an easy thing to happen because in Chinese poetry there is no distinction generally of pronouns, so we don't know if the subject of a line is one or multiple, except from context. So we have this poem is descriptive. It describes these luxurious surroundings, beautiful, exotic objects and expensive objects in those surroundings, and of course the ladies themselves getting pretty and doing their toilette. They are meant to be the ultimate object of luxury, the ultimate object of consumption for the emperor who is coming to enjoy them, and perhaps vicariously for the voyeuristic reader who through this poem gets a glimpse into the palace, into the forbidden realms. So as usual, let's take a look at the poem couplet by couplet. In the 12 towers, made up and ready since morning, they watch for their prince from the immortal's lookout. So the first couplet, as usual, sets the scene and is probably the more dynamic one in painting a scene. So we have these 12 towers, presumably in the imperial precincts, in the harem, and in the 12 towers, they are the palace ladies, the concubines, they have been made up and ready since morning. Since they started, they prepared, they washed themselves, they dressed themselves with luxurious silks and robes and jewelry. They've prepared themselves they've bedecked themselves with perfume and makeup, probably. Since morning, since the beginning of the day, the women have prepared for what is their greatest expectation and duty, which is receiving the emperor. Which the second line clearly states. They watch for their prince from the immortal's lookout. They're watching out to see if the prince is coming. And they are in the immortal's lookout, which probably is a room in their towers. So maybe a pavilion or the balcony from which they might look out. It has an ironic name, though. In the immortal's lookout, well, they're not looking out for any immortal. They're looking out for the emperor, which is for them like an immortal being or a god. And since morning, so probably the emperor is only going to come to the quarters at night if he comes. So they're over eager. Yeah? Second couplet, which is the first of the parallelistic ones. The door latch, a carved animal's head, hangs cold and silent. From a dragon-shaped water clock, their day runs out slowly. So the focus of the poem is on the long, long wait. Early in the morning they started preparing themselves for an imperial visit. The days, long hours pass by. No visit takes place yet. And the day probably feels very long for the concubines. They're doing nothing else than waiting in expectation. They are in luxurious surroundings, and two objects are meant to represent them. A door, a luxurious door latch carved with an animal's head. And I think in the original it's explicitly stated that it's made of some precious metal, maybe gold. So we have this door latch which closes the door to the tower, which gives access to the women, but it's unmoved. It's cold and silent. Nobody has touched it. The emperor has not lifted it. And there's also a dragon-shaped water clock, a clepsydra. This was the cutting-edge technology at the time, only present in luxurious places like the imperial palace. So this beautiful clepsydra is drip by drip counting the time, but the day runs slowly. Whenever you're impatient, whenever you're waiting, time passes at a snail's pace. Third couplet. So, as usual, when we progress in a regulated poem, generally we get like a focus, a zoom in of the images. So, the first couplet had this general panoramic view of the 12 towers in the imperial palace. The second couplet focuses on two objects while we are zooming in into those towers. The third couplet focuses in on the women. Cloud curls combed, again they check the mirror. Silk gowns ready, a little more perfume. We focus on the women, but we don't get the women as such. We get, just as in the previous couplet, we got objects with animal shapes within the 12 towers. Now we get parts of the women which represent them or stand in for them by metonymy. So we get the cloud curls, that is their hair. The hair has been combed, but they still check the mirror obsessively, and comb again and again. They have nothing else to do. So there's an element of preparation for the emperor, but there's also an element of boredom, yeah, of this ennui that is so typical also of our own decadentist, symbolist poetry of the 19th century, like the jaded belle suffering from ennui and recombining her hair again. And silk gowns ready, a little more perfume. The silk gowns are the clothes, they're already clothed. They probably tried many types of different dresses to see which fit them better, and just a little bit more perfume, to attract all the senses of the emperor. So here, this could apply to all the bells. In another version of the poem that I read, as I told you, this was one specific lady that was doing this. And the last couplet. Has the waiting been successful? Well, it's not 100% sure, but it might be. The emperor is going to his quarters, and from there he might call one of the ladies to come. They look across to the main hall and watch through open blinds as uniformed palace maids prepare the emperor's bed. So now the day has finished, it's night. The emperor is going to retire to his quarters, and the ladies in the towers get a sign of this because some servants are preparing the emperor's bed. With the emperor coming to rest, there's the possibility that he will call one of the 12 maids. Which one, if anyone? Well, we don't know. We end with this cliffhanger, if you will. The ladies continue their expectation, just as they did all through the poem, through the very last line. They know the emperor might be coming. Well, he is coming to his sleeping abode, and he might call one of them. Yeah. So they look through the open blinds as the palace maids prepare the emperor's bed. And again, in the other interpretation that I read, this last couplet is also focused on one of the ladies. The one that is in front of the mirror, checking the perfume and everything, is also the one to spot through the blinds that the emperor is going to come. But anyway, the meaning or the tone or anything in the poem doesn't change if you focalize the last four lines through the whole ladies or through one in particular. So that's Feng's poem, and I think it's a very representative poem of this type of poetry, but we haven't encountered that much of it in the anthology. And remember, this is a type of poetry that is, very sensual for its time, and very baroque and ornamental, but would have been slightly frowned upon by the more stuffy Confucian scholar officials, I imagine. But quite nice.